Good evening, welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what might be lurking in those shadows, about what the reality of life is all about, rather than what we think it is. So I'm Dan Hall, and my usual broadcast partner, Dave Jinks, is here with us tonight. Dave, how are you?
Hi, Dan. I'm doing well.
And we have a special person with us tonight. We have an addition to our Anomalies team.
Yes.
And this addition is Sara Rucker Thiessen.
Thank you.
Sara, so nice of you to be with us tonight.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Okay.
Bringing some gender balance.
Right.
To
The
paranormal.
With Dave and my testosterone, we definitely need some gender balance. As I recall, one of the things that we had talked about opening our show with is the uniqueness of where we live.
Yes.
We live in the Pacific Northwest, to be exact, just outside. We all live in little different locations, but the common location is probably Olympia, Washington. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be a unique place when you're talking about the paranormal. So I think that might be a good starting point for us. What is there about this community that we live in, that we maybe see around us on a frequent basis, that emphasizes that there are some strange things going on here? Sara, since you're our newest member of our team, what do you sense about the paranormal here in Olympia? Are there signs that it's active?
Well, absolutely. And I would say that one thing that makes Olympia unique is its citizenry, that we have people that are open-minded to the paranormal and new kinds of science and inquiring minds, questioning authority. Certainly that might be an unofficial model of the Evergreen State College.
I was wondering if the Evergreen State College might come up in this conversation. Right, because those attributes of higher education, and Evergreen seems to be a symbol of that, those seem to be pretty important facets in looking at the paranormal in a way that's somewhat objective and not totally want to make fun of it.
Right.
So Dave, what do you think about our unique location here? How does that contribute to the paranormal?
Well, the first thing I think of is Mount Rainier in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold, which is really the acknowledged beginning of the modern UFO era. When he spotted his discs, were there?
I think there were 9.
Sort of boomerang shaped, golden shimmering discs, and Arnold was in the Air Force.
Well, I think actually he was in the Civil Air Patrol. He was a salesman, and he was over here on some kind of sales gig, and he was looking for a missing plane as part of his CAP duties.
Okay.
At least that's my understanding.
Yes, I think you're right. Yes. And he reported that phenomenon. That unfortunately hasn't been a common thing around Mount Rainier. Otherwise, we'd have all sorts of UFO enthusiasts residing around monitoring the mountain. But the mountain itself is fascinating. Just as a piece of scenery around here, it's fairly unique. Across the country. But that's what I think of every time I look at the mountain, and I can see it right outside the windows of our work, where we work.
Yeah, I'm always very impressed by Mount Rainier, having been raised in Idaho, where there was something 10,000 feet, I'm not sure, maybe in the White Clouds of the Sawtooth, but there's nothing. There weren't any volcanoes where I grew up in Idaho, and that's a very impressive place. So Sara, let's bring Mount Rainier into your perspective here. So do you see something special about that place? I don't know if you're familiar with the Kenneth Arnold story.
I am not, and I've heard talk about grays around the Mount Rainier.
Oh,
have you heard that?
No, but
I haven't heard that either.
You haven't?
Maybe you can tell us about
Well,
that's the reason you're on this show.
I really can't. I think, first of all, we should talk about J.Z. Knight.
Okay.
She is also while she's not found in Olympia proper, she's found out her ranch is in Yelm, which is outside of Olympia by 20 miles or maybe?
Yeah, pretty close to where we're at here.
Yeah, we're very close to Jay-Z right now. But she's not given a lot of, I think, credit in the community. A lot of people view J.Z. Knight, I would say, and her students as well, with maybe some humor. Although, interestingly enough, it attracts a lot of really interesting people with good intentions, and a lot of people, health practitioners and yoga instructors, and it's brought a lot of interesting people to our area. So I don't know.
Maybe I don't know exactly the story of JZ Knight. I mean, I've driven past the what could easily be termed compound, because it is very well guarded. It looks like. I mean, there are big fences and gates and things, and it's big, right? I think Dan has actually been in it. I've never been in it, but
I was
maybe
in part
background
of it.
on who this person is and what she's famous for. And I don't know if you know that, Dan.
Well, channeling the warrior Ramthma. I don't know how old he is.
Several thousand years at least.
Thousands and thousands.
Ramthma.
Yes, I saw her on the Merv. Is it Merv Griffin?
Yeah, quite a while ago.
In the 80s.
Oh.
And I was like, oh my God, this seems so real. She channeled Ramthma on the show, and I was a believer in that moment, that there was something real that she was channeling. If she wasn't, it was an incredible acting job, I will say that. It was, the voice didn't seem to be hers.
That's the interesting thing about JZ Knight, what I know about her. I used to work with several people who, and they referred to themselves as rampsters. I'm not sure why they chose that.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking hamster, rampster. Yeah. But these people, if you want to think of JZ Knight and her School of Enlightenment as being a cult, these people were the least likely members of a cult I've ever seen.
Right.
They were critical thinkers.
Yes.
They were humanistic. They, I think they took JZ Knight with a fair degree of validity, but there was also some skepticism there. So the people I knew in the School of Enlightenment, which is not, maybe a handful, they didn't seem like they were part of a cult.
I would agree with you.
And now, to bring this back to Mount Rainier for a minute, she's had people at her ranch that talk about some of the subjects that we talk about on this program. As a matter of fact, when he was still alive, Philip Corso, who wrote that book The Day After Roswell, and in it he claimed that the United States government had taken technology from flying saucers and then reintroduced that into the mainstream. He was a person who was out there as a speaker. And so, I don't know. It's easy to maybe dismiss JZ Knight, but, and I have heard critical things about her, but maybe sometimes the critical things mask some of the truths that are out there too. So.
Well said, Dan. Yeah.
What else is there about our community? Mount Rainier, JZ Knight?
There are certainly JZ Knight type people all over the place, I guess, but what other places don't have is Sasquatch, and I know Dan is an expert in Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and various hairy men, hairy creatures. But I think it was Dan gave me. I have a poster. You gave that to me, didn't you? It's in my in my den at home, and it's it pinpoints the sightings of the reported sightings over the last 30, 40, 50 years or something of Bigfoot, and just one look at that map and you see just how many times Bigfoot has made an appearance in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, hundreds, thousands maybe.
Right.
And this particular poster has areas where footprints were found, areas where physical sightings of the creature, suspected habitations, and so on. And just looking at that map, it's hard, I believe, to deny that Bigfoot is there. Now, we've had Bigfoot shows before. If you're listening to the show, you probably already think it's a good possibility, or at least you're open to the idea of having a hairy man living in the forest here. But one of the biggest criticisms or questions that I hear when I start talking about Sasquatch is, how could we not have found one yet?
Right.
And my stock response is that we've had, at last count, 40 crashed light aircraft in the Pacific Northwest forests that have yet to be found. So you can lose 40 airplanes in these forests with intensive search and rescue teams going to find humans, and we can't find them. So to me, it's very probable, especially if Sasquatch is an intelligent creature, which by all accounts it is, he is, or she. They don't want to be found, clearly, but that's a whole other discussion again that we have had. You can tune into that on our YouTube page, of course, if you're so inclined. But again, that's fairly unique to the Pacific West, especially Washington State. I mean, I know it goes into Oregon.
Right. Although I was gonna, and I agree that sometimes when people think of Sasquatch, they think of the Pacific Northwest. But if you look on the BFRO, Bigfoot Field Research website, research organization website, they got a map of the United States, and every state in the Union has had Sasquatch reports, with the exception of Hawaii. And there might be some obvious reasons for that.
That's interesting.
It is.
Hawaii wouldn't.
It is, and of course, Sasquatch is not all. Sasquatch is a native, a kind of an anglicized version of a native word, and there are different native names for Sasquatch throughout the United States, depending upon location. Some place it's called Sasquatch, Sonequa, Bukawas, those are names also that come up, and even descriptions of the type of Sasquatch creature. If you get down into the southeast of the United States, there are reports of something called a skunk ape, which sounds a lot like Sasquatch, except smaller and it stinks more. So they choose to call that a skunk ape. But I think you're right when we say the Northwest. I think there's some there's a couple of insurance commercials out there or whatever that highlight Sasquatch as a part of being, part of being in the Northwest. So that's certainly one claim to fame. What other strange things seem to be going on?
Well, before we move on from Sasquatch, I think it's interesting that many of us who live in the area, I would venture to say, have had possibly a second or third hand story about Sasquatch. Maybe I'm overstating that a bit, but I have a coworker who has a brother who was out, hunting, and I think we maybe don't want to give first and last names.
Yeah, there you go.
But her brother was a very seasoned outdoorsman and heard something coming through the forest, making a lot of racket, crashing trees maybe, or smaller trees, and just like scared the bejesus out of him, and he just took off running. And people who are used to the outdoors, they know what a bear is going to sound like. They know elk. They know the bigger creatures. And I don't know if you guys have any stories like that, but people who have had close encounters, possibly with the hairy ape man.
Yeah, and now that you talked about any stories about that, a friend of mine who works at the state capitol told me about an experience that her husband had, and it sounds like the kind of experience you're talking about. And this is within Thurston County.
Right.
They're out hunting in the morning. The guy and his son are out hunting for deer in the morning, and as the sun comes up, they're listening to all the birds and stuff like that, and all of a sudden, quiet. Nothing. And then this gentleman described a sound, an animal-like sound that was coming, he felt, from a creature, wasn't artificial, that just raised the hair on the back of his neck. And of course, when you hear somebody say something like that, that's so subjective. I don't know what he heard.
Right.
But I have a recording that I sent to him, which was made on the Lummi Reservation. And if you remember one of those past shows we did on Bigfoot, I actually interviewed a couple of Bigfoot experiencers up in the Bellingham, Lummi area. But anyway, I sent him this audio file, and he listened to that, and he said, that's what. And this was a audio recording of a native person on the Lummi Reservation who believed that they were recording Bigfoot. So it's more common than maybe we might think. But the other thing you got me thinking about, Sarah, was the prevalence of these paranormal stories is kind of a little bit below the radar, because a lot of times people don't want to talk about these experiences unless they have a receptive audience. And what I would define as a receptive audience is somebody who is not going to make fun of them or not going to be judgmental. Yeah. But that could be about any of these things, whether they have a UFO encounter or ghost encounter.
What I'm curious, possibly, is the perspective that, we have this new team here for the show. What perspectives or lenses that you see the paranormal from? I know more about Dan than I probably do about your background, Dave. But Dan brings a sociologist viewpoint to the table. I'm sort of from arts and education background. But tell me, what's your lens that you bring to the world and how you see things?
Besides just wearing a tinfoil hat.
Yeah.
The rest of us do
You can
something.
take that off now.
Yeah. Well, my background is business, which sounds completely unrelated, and probably it is. I also studied a fair amount of psychology. I almost had a minor in psychology. I think I was a couple classes short. Business was the practical thing that I did. I got a master's in business administration and marketing. And that was just to, have a practical degree. And then psychology was actually where I was very interested in human behavior, of course, human perception. That stuff was just always very interesting. I remember as a kid, my friends and I, instead of going outside and playing football or whatever, we were going to the university library and looking up hypnosis books. We were trying to hypnotize each other because we were fascinated, at age 9 or 10 or something like that.
Yeah.
Because we realized that the mind was the most interesting thing you could spend your time with, investigate, because mysteries are endless, of course. So I wrote a book on lucid dreaming because that was something that was really interesting to me too, and it was something that I could personally experience. I also wrote another book, The Monkey and the Tetrahedron, which was much later. Of course, it was sort of trying to encapsulate all of these subjects that we talk about on this show and see if there's a connection between them. As far as when I got interested for real interested in UFOs and the possibility of extraterrestrial life, all the subjects that we talk about here, it was probably after college for me, in my mid-20s, and I was kind of going through a what do I do with my life thing that everyone goes through when they're, at about that age. And I knew what I was supposed to be doing, which was getting a corporate job and climbing the corporate ladder and, wearing a suit every day and making a lot of money, I guess, theoretically. But that didn't seem that interesting to me, and so I kind of stumbled and bumbled around for many years, working jobs that I probably was way overqualified for, probably working for people that I should be managing, which was awkward for me and for them. And it was just something that I kind of felt and knew from a very young age. This was just, I was interested, and it wasn't simply because, maybe I liked Close Encounters like every kid did. I thought that was, what a cool idea if aliens do exist and whatever. I started reading on the subject, and the first book that I ever picked up at a used bookstore was The UFO Experience, the first book along these lines by J. Allen Hynek. And I read that. I remember even that moment when I saw it on the floor, in a bargain book pile for literally 50 cents or something. And I saw that, I said, UFO, that should be good for a laugh or something. So I picked it up. I started reading it, and I went, oh my God, this is this is actual science. This guy's an astronomer. He worked for the Air Force, on behalf of the Air Force. And what he's saying is that some of this stuff is real. And that was kind of the moment when it moved from being just, an interest and a fascination into there is really something behind this. And of course, once you get into the UFOs or whatever, you move into some of the other areas. And because, as Dan said, they're kind of under the radar, people don't talk about them in public, but most everyone's interested at some level, and they're with close friends who they can say, hey, I had this experience, it was a little weird, what do you think of this? Because I know you're not going to kick me out of the house just because I bring it up. But if I bring it up at work, or I bring it up in my job, if you're in news or science or something, it's just not something you can bring up.
Right.
And that was the moment for me. So that's really the background. As far as why I was interested in the first place, I don't know. I think it's just a human thing. I think it's in all of us to really be interested in knowing the answer to some of these things. I know Dan and I, we always have the conversation about why aren't people more interested? I can't understand why I'm walking around with people who just seem to be just uninterested in some of the most fascinating things we talk about here. So anyway, that was my moment. I don't know if you, Sarah and Dan, have had moments where you kind of took that turn into this field of interest. How young were you when you realized that you were kind of destined to be plagued with this disease of wanting to know why about so many things?
Well, I really want to hear an experience that Sarah shared with us at our pregame meal, because that might be a defining experience on her part. I don't know if that's what she'll say, but I want to relate to something you just said, and that is I work in an academic setting, and this story to me is like, how do we get to where we're at, and what drives us in life? So I have a number of people I work with who are younger than I am, and they're like out of graduate school, and so they, and I also teach political science classes. This one guy that I work with is constantly telling me all the things he's reading in political science, and it's all journal articles, and it's all, it's the stuff you'd kind of read if you were just out of graduate school. And then he frequently asks me what I'm reading. And lo and behold, I'm not reading academic articles about political science or sociology. I'm reading about all these fringe topics that are of interest to me. So at my age, at 63, I know that's me. That's who I am, and other people in academia, you don't always get the best reception when you talk about, well, what'd you do over your summer break? Well, I went looking for Sasquatch. And people kind of, hey, I've got to leave. I have intestinal distress or something. I have to leave, But that's who I am, and that defines me. And so I guess what I'm saying is you kind of know this on some inherent level. And whether you have an experience or what it is, I know that's what I'm drawn to at this point in time in my life.
I wonder, it's interesting how you put it. I've got intestinal distress, I need to leave the room. It almost is that palpable when you're talking with somebody who clearly is uncomfortable with the subject. And I wonder why, because the three of us and people that we hang out with, mostly in secret, because of the stigma, is that it is a place of comfort for us. That's the irony of it, because when we're sitting here asking questions and, freewheeling discussion about the possibilities, that's what, rouses the passion in people like us. But yet, the exact discussion will rouse a great sense of internal conflict and, uncomfortableness in someone who might otherwise share your same background or academic standing or whatever. And I always wonder if there's something inherent in different people that drives them or repels them when it comes to some of these subjects, or if it's just a matter of them not quite reaching the point where they take it seriously like we do now. A lot of people, like you said, your colleagues may just off the bat, off the cuff, whatever, say that can't be true, I won't even think about it. Whereas we're here going, well, I know it's true, so let's pursue it.
You said inherent. I wonder, though, if more of the answer to your question has to do with conditioning. And being conditioned to think that certain things are okay and other things aren't okay. So, if I'm hanging out with Sarah and Dave, I can talk about Sasquatch or UFOs, but if I'm hanging out with a couple of buddies at the college, maybe that's not what they're not going to talk about, because maybe they've been conditioned that those things are real. Where sociology or political science or math or whatever you're interested in is real.
Well, now, along the subject lines of Washington State being a unique place, or at least a hotbed of some of these paranormal and other activities, Sarah, I think, I'm interested to know where she, made this turn in her life, assuming she's on the same path that we are. And I have to assume, because she's sitting here, that she's
same self-destructive path that David.
We do have a lot of paranormal activity, hotspots as far as ghosts and apparent spirit activity. I know Dan has visited, and we have some real great mental hospital.
And I was there on an outpatient basis.
Just to clarify things. Where you might have some intense emotion and other things that potentially are the generative factor in some of these phenomena experiences. And I know that Sarah has, she spoke of a ghost story or two. I'm wondering if that's an area that made you trend a little towards these subjects, or if you were already on the path long before that.
Well, first of all, I would say that a lot of my interests lie, and I'll see what you guys think if you consider this part of the paranormal realm, but things like seeing auras, palm readings, ESP, those are, I'm more interested in what happens between humans that is paranormal than maybe UFOs and other
Sasquatch.
Sasquatch. I'm interested, and I'm a firm believer that aliens have been here and have been visiting Earth for thousands of years. And I'm more interested, like you said, in why people don't believe. And I'm interested from like a sociological standpoint in the social constructs that make it so we don't believe. And I think that's why things like this should be investigated, because I think that we negate so much of reality because of a shared understanding of what we think reality is. But in my own, and I'm not an academic or like you guys are more brainy and well-read. I'm more experiential. Well, that's how I perceive you guys.
Have we got you fooled?
Yeah, but in my family, people were open to the notion of it. So, for instance, as a kid, after my grandfather passed, my mom said she saw him walk through the living room. We were driving down the driveway, but she saw his outline in the picture windows with these big windows. And so, I mean, I grew up with maybe people that thought that was entirely possible. When I was a young woman, so I lived in Michigan. I lived in an old farmhouse outside of Chelsea, Michigan. And I had two experiences. One was while I was taking a shower, something tapped me on the shoulder, and there was just no explanation for it. And I think I disregarded it in a sense, but also realized it was real, it happened, but had no explanation. And then in that same house, one night, it was a bad storm. I was awake. Everybody wants to go, well, are you sure you were awake? Yes, I'm sure I was awake. And something called my name, first and last name. And it sounded like an old lady, I guess, an older elder. And what was very peculiar about it is the lips were very dry, like she needed a drink of water. And it scared the hell out of me. And I thought, well, maybe it was my grandmother because she had died like within the last year or so, but I can't be sure of that at all. It could have been just a haunting related to the house and that space. And I know, most people aren't going to believe that. I have no proof of it, but I heard it, and it was real. And other people had experiences in that house. So that's probably the strongest experience I've had with the paranormal, and yet I'm still probably more interested in wanting to see some auras. And apparently I don't know if this is real or not, but there are exercises that you can do to see that, and certainly I think they've been picked up scientifically, right? Weren't the Russians famous for that? And some imaging?
Aura photography?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's been a lot of people who've been into that.
So I don't think that reality is what we perceive it to be, and I think that we'd be better off as a humanity if we let ourselves see beyond what we think is real, and for all sorts of reasons, to see that we're, maybe we are all connected.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of, maybe that's a little segued into a different discussion, why study the paranormal, but I want to go back to the Evergreen State College for a second. And I know you worked there.
Yeah.
Did you ever run across a student by the name of Christopher Bader, B-A-D-E-R?
No.
Well, why he's interesting in this conversation is he and another guy who currently work at Baylor University wrote a book called Paranormal America. And they're both sociologists. And one of the things they do, this comes from the Baylor University study on religion. They have a survey that they give out, just like typical academic surveys with a random sample of people, and they ask them a lot of questions about paranormal issues because they're kind of related to religion. Well, what's interesting about what you just said is that they've noticed a difference between men and women in terms of what they're interested in the paranormal.
Yeah.
And the topics that you're speaking to, palm reading, some kind of divination, the tarot, or aura readings, those seems to be topics that women gravitate toward.
Interesting.
And men turn. Boy, I'm having trouble, and I haven't had anything to drink. They seem to turn to topics like the UFOs and Sasquatch. And how they further divide that is that they say that people who join paranormal groups. Now, I don't know that necessarily describes us. I mean, I'm in a couple paranormal groups, but some people don't join paranormal groups. So it might be just those people who are interested. Seem to be either interested from the aspect of wanting to be enlightened by the paranormal, or they're interested in discovery. And women tend to be more persuaded by the enlightenment factor of the paranormal, and guys are more into the discovery, which would kind of fit with, is there a Bigfoot or are there aliens out there? But to hear you say that...
gender balance here on this team.
To hear you say that is just a validation of all the stuff that they've researched.
Interesting. Yeah.
I can see women being more, I don't think it's a stereotype to say, more person to person, more interested in the interactions between people, whereas guys, well, I'm kind of on the extreme end. I'm somewhat of a hermit. I work from home mostly, and I can go a week without seeing anybody, well, except for my family comes home to me.
Who you have to see.
But I think, it makes sense now that men are more interested in the external, whereas women might be more interested in the interpersonal relationship. Now, of course, I'm very interested in some of the things you said, the telepathy, ESP. Again, I'd point to experiments. Dean Radin is the PhD Princeton, I believe, who has really compelling evidence about, over the past 100 years of experiments, repeated over and over, hundreds, thousands, millions of trials that show that there is a real mind-matter interaction. Now, their experiments mostly are mind and matter, which I guess again kind of puts me into the male category, because I'm talking about people versus machines, and you're talking about people and people. But you have to assume that if there's a connection between people and machines, that you can have connections between people and people, right? And so it's it's all sort of a different facet of the same diamond, or however you want to put it. It's all looking at the same thing from a different view. But it is interesting, Dan. I hadn't heard that, the differences between male and female as far as interests.
Well, in a class that we're just finishing up, which is kind of more of a community ed class than it is a college class, we got talking about poltergeists. And some people believe that poltergeists are not really ghosts per se, but they're the psychic projections of our own energy. It's psychokinesis. If I want to make the microphone levitate, I'll will it to levitate. And so I brought that up to people and in the class, and what I found kind of interesting, and I talked about Uri Geller, who, if you know about that guy, he's supposedly able to bend spoons, but it seemed to be that there were several people in that class who were not as much interested in hearing about any academic study that might validate psychokinesis. They were more interested in reaffirming their view, which was that's all been proven a hoax. So it goes back to this idea, and I don't, we're talking about how could we, some of us be so passionate about this and some people be so indifferent. I kept thinking while I was listening to this discussion that these people are rejecting arguments based on science in favor of ideas that validate their own belief system. And it just showed to me how powerful validation of your belief system is, because you and I have had that discussion about if you want to change somebody's mind, that sometimes 10 arguments that could change their mind will be ineffective, but a story that somehow captures the emotional aspect of what's going on might hit home.
We just described our whole political
well, that's true. I think you're right.
State of affairs.
Right.
People believe, what supports what they already believe, right?
Yeah,
so that's kind of what you're saying.
A good friend who saw a UFO or encountered what they thought was a Sasquatch in the forest, that can carry more weight even than a perfectly constructed scientific study. Yep. Now, I always say that if I could get the most hardened skeptic in a room with no way to escape for, say, half a day or something, and I could force them to read the books that I've read and follow the same train of logic that I've followed to get to where I am, it's not like I just woke up one day and believed everything, which is what the skeptics or pseudo-skeptics is more accurate would suggest, because they say, well, Dan really believes in everything, he's too far gone, nothing can change his mind. Well, I would say the same thing about them, and I'm convinced that there's enough evidence out there that I could convince anybody, if given the time and the attention, that they're wrong.
Right.
Of course, I don't know if that's true because it never, you never get the opportunity to do that. But of course, this is part of what we do in the show is try to lay out some things, give some references here or there. And people who are on the fence may run across this and go do a little research like I did with the first UFO book. I looked at it, I thought, that seems kind of hokey, but I'm going to look at it anyway. And by the time you're done, you're going, wow, maybe I should look at the next book. Maybe I should look a little further. And then when you start going down that path, of course there are lots of dead ends along the way. And I don't think anybody here is arguing that there isn't a lot of garbage out there and all surrounding all these subjects. And in fact, that's one of the reasons people who are otherwise interested in it don't pursue it, because it's so hard to weed through the crap to figure out what's true. Well, and some of that's by design, of course, we would argue, with the disinformation that's out there and that
cover-ups.
Yeah, and that stuff can be proven easily. I mean, that's like the easy part of this, is that just by virtue of making an argument about why a government would want to cover up, or why the mainstream media would prefer not to discuss certain things and whatever, all that military industrial complex motivation, blah blah blah. That's pretty easy to lay out and convince people of, but after that point a lot of people are like, well, yeah, something's going on, but I know it ain't aliens. Because that's just too over the top and too unbelievable. And it's kind of the same for all of these subjects. It's like, yeah, there's probably some, creature out there, but it sure isn't, what's the Bigfoot in the Gimlin Patterson? Patty.
Patty, right.
It sure ain't Patty, because I know that's a guy in a gorilla suit, back in 1967 or whatever.
With breasts.
Yeah, with breasts. And a big bump on their leg. Interesting you would say about logic, because I almost see that working in a different way. And what I'm talking about is, in this class recently, this community ed class, we're talking about the existence of various cryptids. Bigfoot's one, and we're talking about using logic to either prove or refute their existence. And one of the logical fallacies that somewhere I came across in school was this idea of transference, where if you have let's say someone says, okay, I have a picture of Bigfoot, or I have some kind of proof of Bigfoot, and that's proven to be a hoax. So what happens within people's minds is then they take that hoax and they transfer it to each subsequent piece of evidence. So pretty soon they're using the one logical fallacy to devalue or to eliminate all proof of information that might validate the existence of some of these things. I see that going on a lot when I talk in a classroom setting about, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about paranormal things. It could be about politics, the same way kind of thing. So Obama said this, he's a liar, so everything else he says is going to be a lie. So I think logic is at work sometimes, but it's more of like an ill logic.
Well, you have to be vigilant in your logic, how you apply it to everything, but that just takes so much mental energy for people to analyze every particular case thoroughly. So of course it's easier just to say, well, that was fake, so probably everything's fake.
Right.
Especially when there's no penalty in this society we have of making the wrong decision about it, because that's what we're conditioned to think. That's what the various cover-ups and agencies, people, groups that make money off of having us sort of be in the dark all the time. That's of course what they want, because that's what power and money always wants. They want to keep the power and money themselves. So if you make a decision, however wrong it may be, that coincides with what they, in quotes, want you to believe, there's no penalty for being wrong. But meanwhile, there's people like us who are always bumping into the wall saying, but what about this? What about that? You're not thinking about this. What about the 1,000 sightings of whatever? The witness had no reason whatsoever to make it up. Police officers reporting UFOs, and presidents are reporting UFOs, or whatever.
Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan. Yeah. So since this is Halloween, which I think we didn't mention maybe earlier, I got thinking about, and I don't know if this is the last segue we want to go down. I guess that our conversation always determines that. But what makes Washington unique from a standpoint of ghosts? Well, I mean, we talked about Sasquatch, we talked about UFOs. What do you know about Washington that makes us a center for ghostly activity? What have you heard?
I think Dan should be the one to discuss that, because you've actually made field trips, road trips to mental hospitals and battlegrounds or cemeteries. I mean, we've got a lot of. You've done some EVP recordings, electronic voice phenomena, right?
Right. I just didn't want to.
You
I
get
just
a
didn't want to
feel.
make it about me.
You were trying to introduce yourself.
No, I wasn't.
Kidding.
Yeah, that's pretty
Well,
self-centered.
Sarah, I have very few experiences with ghosts and knowledge of specifics,
Yeah.
so you guys can.
Well, in Olympia,
Yeah.
I haven't had any firsthand experiences,
But what have you heard?
but I've heard.
Yeah. What have you heard?
Yeah. Let me do maybe for our next show some research, because I had a friend. So I'm an actress and I'm in a theater ensemble, and we had a member at one time whose house had been haunted right down on off of 22nd, and it had to do with, I think, a murder and a father and a son, but one of the two was showing up in their house, and I think they had to do an exorcism or something to try to move the spirit on. But it seems like a lot of old hotels, other establishments. Dan and I have been down to Centralia to what's it called down there?
You're talking about the Olympic Club.
The Olympic Club, and
McMinimans.
And we went with a psychic. We took
did,
a psychic, Isaac. And you say more, because this is more your area.
Well, and I don't want it just, like I said, don't want it just to be about me. And I guess that would be the hard part, to say that our area is any more haunted than any other area, because my experience with the ghostly aspect of the paranormal says that every place is haunted,
Right.
and that there are just people that can more easily pick up on it, and sometimes you can get objective evidence of that. I will talk about, though, that you mentioned Isaac, I will talk about Western State Hospital for a second, because I think that's a unique place. We have run ghost hunting classes through Olympia Parks and Rec, and that spot, the cemetery of the Western State Hospital, so that would be people are buried there who are in various different reincarnations of Western State Hospital, and people who are currently there. And then there's an area called the Old Ward on the Hill, where patients who could be ambulatory and not be a threat to themselves worked on a farm. Essentially, it's self-sustaining. So we take people to that cemetery, and we take people up to that. The only thing that's left of that old building is a footprint of the foundation. And that's some amazing things happen. People who go there, and I'll mention my friend Isaac as a good example. The first time he went there, and Isaac suspected that he had some abilities as sensitive or intuitive, but the minute he started feeling a little uncomfortable in the cemetery, but by the time he got to the footprint of the building, he had literally blacked out. He was still walking, but he wasn't in the space and time that the rest of us were in. And what he thinks he was experiencing, and Isaac comes across as somebody who's pretty empathetic, were the emotions of people who were placed in Western State Hospital, mostly against their will. And those energies were still in that space, and he could pick those up. And the fact that more than one person like Isaac has had that situation and had to either leave the spot or just broke down emotionally, I would say that Western State Hospital area is pretty psychically active. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because mental illness and the things that were done on behalf of people who are mentally ill, I don't think that's a pretty page in history. Electroshock therapy, giving people high doses of insulin to shock their system out of some psychotic, I don't know, just some of those things seem pretty barbaric. So I think that cemeteries, and particularly that cemetery, has a vibe to it. But you could find that probably at any mental hospital in any state. That wouldn't be specific to Washington. Well, what other topics? Is there something you want to say in conclusion, or some topic that we've kind of left undiscovered, so to speak, with our inaugural show here with Sarah, and what makes Washington paranormally particular and how we gravitate toward that?
I think that that this will be a discovery and a journey, and I hope that we can bring some other people in to share their experiences and investigations, so that we can broaden what we know about the area.
Well, Washington's interesting because it has such a diversity of people. As you mentioned, this is really a hotbed of liberalism right here in Olympia, Evergreen State University, and But it also, and we've got mountains and the ocean right next door, but then we've got virtual deserts through the middle of the state.
Right.
And so we have sun, we have
Indigenous people.
harshest
native,
of winters,
yeah.
indigenous people. We're
Yeah.
close to, we're right up next to Canada.
Uh-huh.
And so I think Washington is pretty unique in terms of its geology and topography, and that you would think would lend itself to possibly creating a wider range of paranormal. I mean, I'm making a case for Washington State here. I still think we're unique. I still look at the UFO. It's kind of neat that I can look out my window and just see where
The start of that
where
whole
it
thing.
started.
Right.
Now, we know, if anyone who's looked into UFO phenomena, we know that it's been going on for forever,
Yeah.
basically. But the modern era right there, and every time I look up at Mount Rainier, I hope to see some objects circling it or something. I haven't yet. But if some of this phenomena is tied to the land in some way, then we certainly would have every opportunity to have a lot of weird stuff going on around here. And so, I'd say UFO and Sasquatch are pretty Sasquatch proper. I know that Dan mentioned various other creatures that inhabit the rest of the country, but we don't. I guess we don't have dogmen or mothmen or any other range of weird things. But we do. I think we can claim those phenomena. And I know we have got an entire book here of weird Washington. We've got our share of weird stuff, but I don't know that we have anything, like Dan said, that's any more compelling than in other areas, because wherever people are, that's where we see interesting stuff happening.
Well, welcome, Sara Rucker
Thank you.
Thiessen, to
Thanks
this
for
team.
including me.
Yes. This will be a good collaboration, a long-term collaboration. So we'll say goodnight and happy Halloween
Yes.
to you.
Happy Halloween.
And
Happy Halloween.
we'll be with you on the next episode of Anomalies.